Hello, and welcome to our Training Industry Leader Talk on the Learner Experience, brought to you by GP Strategies, Allego, Lemonade LXP, Arist, and Biz Library. I'm Hope Williams, Associate Editor at Training Industry, and I'll be co-hosting today's event with Elizabeth Parker, our Marketing and Event Manager here at Training Industry. And we're so happy you've joined us for today's conversations. I'm super excited to hear what our 5 speakers have in store for us today. Before we dive into our first session, I would like to first go over a few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speakers and get the most out of your time with us today. Throughout each session today, please feel free to utilize that chat window to collaborate with your fellow attendees or chat with myself and the other panelists. Pop open that Q&A window to ask your questions for the speaker, and we'll have a dedicated Q&A time at the end of each session. I also encourage you to share the information you received today via social media by following our handle at Training Industry. That is Training Industry without the Y. We will be engaging in the Twitter conversation throughout the event today, so please feel free to join us there. At the end of your time with us today, you'll notice that a short survey has popped open in your browser, and we'd greatly appreciate your thoughts on anything regarding today's event. And lastly, all of our sessions will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive a follow-up email from us with a link to those on-demand sessions following today's presentations. If this is your first Training Industry event, we'd like to share a special welcome with you. Training Industry exists to support the learning leader. We offer timely and insightful information on the business of learning through live events like today's Leader Talk, as well as through website and magazine articles, research reports, referral services, and our podcast, just to name a few. Find all the ways we can connect you with expert perspectives in the industry at trainingindustry.com. Today's event is made possible by our sponsors, and here's a quick message from GP Strategies. Awesome. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our first speakers today, Cara Halter and Tom Pizer. Cara Halter is the Director of Innovation, Research, and Development for GP Strategies, where she consults with clients on digital learning transformation, creation of innovative digital learning experiences, and learner-centric design principles to maximize business impact through learning. Cara has over 20 years of experience working with Fortune 500 companies and a master's degree in instructional design and technology. Tom Pizer is the Director of Learning Technologies for GP's Learning Solutions Group and has over 20 years of experience in the technical digital media field. He has an extensive background in a variety of creative and technical mediums, including digital media specification, production, testing, and implementation. During his career, Tom has created, specified, directed, and managed hundreds of hours of educational, instructional, and entertainment-based media, and has served clients in a wide variety of markets, including the federal government, trade associations, commercial organizations, and educational institutions. Tom and Cara, it's a pleasure having you with us today, and without further ado, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hope. And give me just 1 second here and I will start to share. Oh, no, I think you need to stop sharing before I can, huh? There we go. I will share our presentation. Okay, give that a second to load. And Hope, are we good?
All good, Cara, thank you.
I can see it.
All right. So welcome, everybody. I know Tom and I are really excited today. I think we've got a really interesting session for you, and we're really excited to hear all of your questions and have a great dialogue today as well. So today's session is about filtering through the noise, what technology is right for your learners. And what this is really all about is, as I'm sure many of you are as overwhelmed as we are at any given point about how many different learning technologies are really out there. This is a space that is changing just so rapidly, and there's new people entering the market all the time, and it can be a bit overwhelming of like, what does learning really even mean anymore, and what are all these different technologies that are supporting those various types of learning. So we're here today to really try to give you an idea of how do you filter through that? How do you really start to evaluate what technologies are out there, which ones are going to be applicable to your business, which ones align to the different learning experiences that you're trying to achieve for your learners. What technology constraints do you have within your company? What's your timeline? What kind of budget do you have? Obviously you can't invest in limitless technologies. So how do you start to prioritize and decide which one's really going to align best for you? And I think I love this graphic. And this graphic is actually one that training industry put together, but this is just a little taste of all of the different logos from the many different vendors that play in the learning space. So if you go out to training industry's website, I'm sure you can find a new version of this all the time. This is a good example, I think, of just how overwhelming it really can be, and how many different types of technologies are out there, how they might start to be categorized into different, sets of tools, and how quickly that landscape really changes. I think every day there is a new player entering the market. There's companies that are merging and coming together to form new companies, and even some of the old players that have been around a long time are constantly evolving and changing the tools that they do offer, that sometimes starts to put what you thought you knew of as their tool into a different category. They're starting to add new feature sets that stretch their capabilities. So it's really hard to keep up with, and really hard to kind of sort through and figure out what should you pay attention to, and when you do identify a need, how do you start to identify where you should go? So that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. I want to give you just a brief overview of how GP Strategies has opted to sort of organize all of this noise. What do we see as a learning ecosystem, and how you start to layer all of these different technologies and tools together to form something that can support a really strong learner experience. And then we'll talk a little bit about our process and the team that we have dedicated to innovation and really evaluating and looking at these different tools. And then I will hand it over to my partner in crime with Tom to really walk through a pretty detailed example of how we actually did review and help select a technology for one of our clients. Okay, so this is what we have evolved over the last several years to look at our work learning ecosystem. And a bit of a fun story here. This is, started several years back, but it actually started on a napkin in a pub in Singapore, which I don't know, I kind of like fun little fun facts when you're when you're getting to know a new speaker. So that's how it started, and it has evolved tremendously over the last few years since then, as the technologies have changed. But the whole purpose of putting together something like this is really just to help us understand what are all the parts and pieces that play into a learning environment. And so I'm sure many of you are starting to know, and in your organizations, you're already getting a sense of learning is no longer just about a learning management system that has a list of e-learning courses and classroom training, and maybe a few other things thrown in, like some videos or some PDF documents. The types of things that learners are using in order to learn is just so vast now. So this is what we started to put together to put all those pieces into some kind of a framework that allows us to really think about how they all interact, how they work together, what are the types of learning experiences that we're trying to achieve, and how do these start to also connect to, the right side of this chart, the actual point of work. And you'll see I've got a tip later on that, the more digital that we all go, the more, the remote world that we're all living in is, the more that we really depend on technology to do our jobs. I think we're finding that the distance between our point of learning and our point of work is shrinking. And so learners are expecting to be able to get to that learning in a very seamless, very quick, very smooth way. So that's why our ecosystem is not just about our learning tools, but also starting to show how those connect to the various work systems that you're in and collaborating with your colleagues in every day. So just without going too far into this, we could certainly run an entire session, I think, just about this diagram. But just to give you the high level look of it, at the top, we look at points of access. Where are learners going to start their learning experience? How are they actually getting to the content? How are they searching for it? How are they starting to consume it? And there's lots of different options for how that might happen. Then you sort of layer in what device are they using to get to that point of access. Obviously, we all have our laptops, our standard computers, but that is also starting to expand to a whole variety of mobile devices, and even starting to get into some of the newer wearable technologies, whether that's a watch or Google Glass or things like that. And then the bottom 4 layers is really what starts to get into the more traditional ideas around learning, thinking about how do you measure things, how do you experience the content, what are the different types of modalities, but well beyond the modalities of the traditional e-learning and classroom. What are those different types of experiences now rather than modalities that you're going to start to look at and evaluate? And then how do you actually start to create the assets that play into those experiences and manage all of the pieces that go with it? So lots to think about. And of course, underneath any one of the blocks on this page, there are even more boxes that can start to probably break down into even more categories and many, many vendors that you could start to evaluate and consider. So before I click to the next slide, I'm kind of curious here, if another reason for us to use our chat, as you sit and think about your own training organization or your own just company as a whole, how many different technologies do you think your organization currently uses for training or for learning? We can love to see how broad the different numbers are from our group today.
Too many. Good answer.
Oh.
20 plus, not enough. Another true answer.
Very true.
Ooh, the answers are really coming in now. About 4, 3 to 5, probably typical. If we're talking about enterprise systems, probably looking at, you're looking at expense per enterprise system, right? So we're looking at, the organization has to focus on where they're going to put their dollars per seat. But there are some organizations that have so many, especially if you're a large global organization, you might find that there are multiple LMSs or multiple LXPs.
Yeah, so I think you're getting a sense of, depending on how mature your organization might be, you may have not enough, you may have too many, and you're not really sure whether or not you have the right ones, which I think is a very common trend across many of us.
Very important. Yeah.
Yeah, so with that in mind, just quickly covering from a GP Strategies perspective, we have started to tackle this with what we refer to as our innovation kitchen. And so this is a pretty simple 5-step process for us to try to sort through, what do we actually want to dig deeper into? So this starts with discovery, and that's, largely what has been driving the evolution of that ecosystem map that you just saw a minute ago. We find out about all these things through just continuous conversation, through research. Sometimes it comes to us where things just randomly show up in your inbox, like invitations to today's webinar, for example. Sometimes our clients ask us to look into things in particular. We're constantly seeking out, watching demos, attending other webinars, and just talking to people, attending conferences, things like that. So as we start to discover all of these different pieces, then we look at, okay, what do we need to refine from this? What is the need that maybe one of these solutions can actually solve? What's the why behind these different tools? Like, why would we want to use this? Is there really a good value behind it? Does the value match what the investment is and the effort required to put it in place? How easy is it to use? We start to think about those questions to decide, is this something we want to pursue? Is it something we really want to get a better, real sense of how it works? And when we get to that point, that takes us to the third step, which is experiment. And this is really, our goal here is to fail faster, if you will. Try to really test and learn and, find out, is this actually a viable solution in the environment that we're talking about and for the business need that we've identified? So we try to orchestrate review processes, little experimental pilots, things like that to really get a better sense of what the tool is about. And then those last two steps are, of course, just taking all that information that we learned, reflecting on it, figuring out what to do with it, sharing that more broadly across our organization or our client's organization, and then deciding how to integrate it. And I think one thing that's important to note is that integrating and really deciding to go forward with something doesn't always mean an enterprise-wide significant investment. Maybe it is just another couple of small pilots. Maybe it's only implemented in a small focused area somewhere. So there's lots of different ways that we can work within the structure to take it to varying levels of complexity. So with that in mind, the rest of this conversation is really going to start to take us to one particular example of a tool that we were asked to experiment with, and that is in the gamification space. So one of our clients had sort of done this analysis, looked at this map as a way to identify where are we now, where do we want to be, where are some gaps that we might want to fill, and they identified gamification as something that they wanted to look into further. So they came to us and said, we need help. What can we do to look at gamification and really start to evaluate what tools are out there and whether or not they're going to work in our environment? So our first question was, and I'm going to have the same question to you, what is gamification? I think so. Just this is another great chat question. If you guys want to answer, throw your quick ideas of when you hear the word gamification, what comes to mind for you?
Making learning challenging and fun. That's part of it. Engagement, definitely. Fun and fast. Oh my goodness.
Oh, the answers are coming so fast, they're hard to read.
Oh, yeah. Rewards and competition. That's a part of it. Intrinsic, extrinsic rewards, for sure. Competition, validation. Yep.
Yeah, I think I saw
retention
in there. Yeah.
Like that one. Yeah. Learning reinforcement along lines with retention. Yep. Badging. Badging also leans into certification. Yep. Challenges, challenging. Simulation and game. I'm glad that somebody put that in there. Real life simulation. I'd add into that real life simulation, real life assessment, maybe simulated on the job, some cases, involving the learner.
Yeah, these are fantastic answers. And I think you're all hearing exactly what I expected, which was when you start thinking about some of these more modern learning terms and some of these things that we start to throw into more learning experiences rather than just pure modalities, they're hard to define. They can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think that is true for many of those terms that you saw in our ecosystem map. If I were to ask the same question about adaptive learning or social learning or chatbots or micro learning, all of these things I think you're going to see, can span in a lot of different directions and have different meanings depending on what your personal experience has been or what you've learned about that particular technology. So that's typically where we start. Once we get into, this is part of that refine stage, which was when we want to experiment with something, we needed to have refined it first to think about, what is it that we're really trying to evaluate. So before I hand it over to Tom, I wanted to quickly give you a sense of what gamification means. This first slide, you can see instead of trying to purely define it, so that first sentence there of using game thinking and game mechanics in a non-game context in order to engage learners and solve problems is a super high level definition. But more importantly, we start to try to look at what's the actual impact that we think this type of technology can bring to our learners. And that's what these bullet points here are really trying to get at is, how can we influence our learners to better engage them, to better change behaviors, to really, get them learning in a new or unique way. And just to further acknowledge a lot of the ideas that I saw coming in our chat, we try to distinguish a bit between game-based learning and gamified learning. And game-based learning is more those simulation kinds of things that Tom, I think you called out. Game-based learning is really, the game is the content. You are deeply involved. Maybe you're playing the role of a character, or maybe you're into, answering some questions that when you answer the questions, it starts to, branch in a really interesting way. So that really is game-based learning versus gamified learning, where you've added game-like elements to the content someplace else. So that could just mean, adding points and a leaderboard to traditional types of content, giving prizes or awards for something, having you achieved throughout the program. But regardless of which of those two things you're talking about, a lot of our gamification solutions include one or many or all of the things on the right. And I think that's where you'll see a lot of those themes that we saw coming in your answers are probably reflected here as well. And I'm sure we could probably add a few more to the list based off of the answers that we saw coming in. So this is kind of what we started with, is just what is gamification, and then how in particular in this instance, what aspects of gamification do we care about the most? And I'll save the answer to that question for Tom here in a minute. So before I hand it over, just sort of summarizing, what do we, when we're looking at any technology and we're starting to really think about evaluating things, learner expectations are shifting, right? We're not in just an e-learning or ILT world anymore. So I just wanted to throw out a few of, this is sort of, my handbook, I guess, if you will, of what is learning experience all about, since that's the theme of today. And for me, it really is about focusing less on learning events and modalities and really focusing more on the experience and the business impact. I mentioned earlier that distance between the point of learning and the point of work is shrinking. So what can you do to actively help jump that gap? You're going to hear a bit from Tom here in a bit about, you really try to avoid the shiny object syndrome by thinking about what the business impact is and what that experience into evaluating the tool. If you don't kind of have an idea of what you're looking for, it's really easy to get sucked in by the shiny objects because there are a lot of them out there. The other thing I would say is that, as you start to go down these paths, don't necessarily get stuck by, I don't have the money to do this, or I don't have the right tool to be able to do that particular type of experience that I want. I've seen lots of creative solutions out there that really allow you to do things that you didn't think you could do with the tools that you already have. So just, a bit of advice there in terms of think creatively and try to think about what you can do to maybe use a tool in a way that it wasn't intended to be used. And then the last one is thinking systemically. I think this has probably been one of my biggest ahas of my boss and I often refer to ourselves as recovering instructional designers. And I think this is one of my biggest things is, I used to be very focused on the content and the delivery and the modality of that and meeting objectives and all of that. And I've started to really think more about the whole system surrounding the learning, whether that's what's motivating the learners, where the environment is that they're coming from, what's the communication plan around it, how do you drive change management, all of those different parts and pieces, that really influence the entire human experience and make sure that everything's connected. And you're going to see a lot of flavor of that in what Tom shares as well. All right. And I know, Tom, we are definitely running short on time, so I will hand this over to you quickly. We will try to get through this as fast as we can.
Yeah, I think we're okay on time. I want to leave some time at the end for questions, but Cara, I think we're good. So, as Cara indicated, we have, well, actually several methodologies for evaluating tools. But what I want to take you through is one particular instance to give you an example of how we tackled this particular challenge. So the reason that Cara went in the direction of discovering the gamification aspect is because in this particular case, the client was interested in gamification. And the first question came up, well, what does gamification mean to you, or what does gamification mean to your learners? So the client came to us and said, look, we've got a program coming up and we want to engage our learners and we want them to want to come back and we want them to have fun. We think that gamification is the way to do this. We would like your evaluation and recommendation for platforms. And oh, by the way, we would like this in 2 weeks. It's a pretty lofty request, especially given the fact that we know that in 2 weeks, we're not going to be able to get inside and fully hands-on evaluate these platforms. So we needed to come up with a strategy that was going to give us meaningful data on the back end. So we started with an overview, with a little bit of research and some planning and alignment. So in the research, we already knew of some of the gamified learning platforms that were out there, but something else that we wanted to do is we wanted to start by getting the lay of the land. So what does gamification mean to the organization? What behaviors are they looking to change or influence or impact? What kind of measures do they want to get out of the back end? And to what degree do they want to have the ability to course correct along the way? We wanted to take that information and turn that into our planning and alignment. So that is, what measures are we going to review? How are we going to define success criteria for each of the platforms, and how are we going to distill this down into something that is exportable to meaningful data? So in the end, how is our client going to be able to evaluate these platforms and determine what is more likely going to be the right platform for them? And we'll show you the output of that as well, and how we ended up supporting the recommendation aspect. Because in the end, we're putting ourselves on the line, GP Strategies, we're putting ourselves on the line. We're making a recommendation for a platform or platforms, so they better meet those requirements. So we started with an abbreviated workshop, and in that abbreviated workshop, we asked some questions about the learners, about their roles and about their journey. We asked some questions about the business and what the business's goals were and what they were hoping to measure and what performance they were hoping to drive. But we also asked the magic wand question. And for those of you who don't know the magic wand question, it is, if you had a magic wand and you had 3 wishes that you wanted this platform, this gamification platform, to be able to support or do or excel at, what would that be? And of course, you're going to get answers across their learner audience, but these are what we got from the client. So if they were forced to distill it down into a narrow group, these were the elements that they wanted to ensure were in the platform. Push versus pull. They wanted to be able to continue to drive the performance of the learners rather than relying on the learners to come back to the platform. So they wanted some mechanism in order to ensure that the learners were were accessing the content and performing. They wanted to create some degree of competition. In this case, the learners were sales-based employees. And so that idea of intrinsic reward, prestige, was assumed by the organization that was going to drive engagement. They wanted something that created engagement. Now, at this point, the client didn't know if it was game-based or gamified that was going to drive that engagement. That's something that we were going to prepare to clarify. They wanted features that generated continued access. I'll clarify what that means in a moment, but we start thinking about social communication, peer-to-peer. We start thinking about competition. We start thinking about engaging activities. We start thinking about resource management, performance support tools. And then they wanted some learner feedback mechanism. Now, this one actually threw us off at first, a learner feedback mechanism. They wanted the learners to be able to communicate back to the L&D department in order to be able to take their feedback and course correct the value of the tool over time. Next slide, please. All right. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure of is how we define success for these platforms, in particular a technology platform like this. So as a technology lead, director of learning technologies, I'm often asked, you know, what technology is good, what technology is beneficial. And of course, we can take evaluation criteria and we can determine a good video-based platform, a good social-based platform, a good learning experience-based platform, gamified platform, but that only gets you the platform. There are 2 other key components to ensuring the success of one of these platforms. Of course, I'm sure we got lots of instructional designers. I know that Cara is a recovering instructional designer. We've got content strategy. The content's got to be good. It's got to be developed in a way that is supported by the platform, that uses all the best capabilities of the platform, but ultimately the content has got to be good. But something that's often forgotten is that communication strategy, especially when we're deploying a new platform. That communication strategy has got to continue to prepare the students, prepare the organization, launch, and then there's got to be continued drive and continued communication in order to ensure that it is that it is landed successfully and that it is continuing to grow successfully. Next slide. What we did is, since we only had really 2 weeks of analysis, we ended up extending it by a third. We established some evaluation criteria. We put together a group of 4 and then later 5 practitioners. And those practitioners all had experience in the learning technology and learning and development practices. These were individuals who had experience in either gamification platforms or platform selection. So we took the client's requirements and we mapped those out to 7 key criteria. Those were categorized as learning styles, game mechanics, built-in games, engagement, reporting, social components, security, and integration. And then we further subdivided that into additional evaluation criteria. The bottom line here is we wanted to make sure that we were making apples and apples comparisons to all of the platforms that we were going to be evaluating. Some of them were on content and how the content is deployed. Others were on those other value-added capabilities. And then before we even got into the evaluation of the platforms, we wanted to make sure that what we were reviewing was mapping directly to their upcoming curriculum. So the reason they asked for us to evaluate these gamification platforms because they were preparing for a major launch that's coming in the next couple of years. And as part of that launch, they want to ensure that this platform is going to be able to support pre-launch activities, launch activities, and post-launch activities. And those activities are going to be different, and they needed something that was going to drive completion through this entire learning cadence. If we were to take a look at just the launch subsection of that, next slide, Cara. Then the curriculum for the launch phase breaks down from a very high level like this. We've got client-led events, we've got dealership experiences, we've got web-based training experiences, and just-in-time resources. And what we are going to need for this is a tool that's going to drive the interstitial learning. And interstitial just simply means those elements in between is going to support all of these activities and is going to reinforce, drive, and create engagement discussion around each of these events. Next slide. So who we vetted, there are a lot of gamification players out there. So, and we already knew some of these. We're already partnered at GP Strategies with some of these, but also the client wanted us to gather from a large net. So we went out and evaluated. We queried our existing Innovation Kitchen team, as Cara had mentioned. We moved across GP Strategies leadership, other accounts who have integrated game-based and gamified platforms. We reached out to known areas where these technologies are compared. Cara was a great resource out there. It's kind of, you could almost call it the Yelp of enterprise systems. And of course, anytime you do a sector research in one particular sector, like gamification, you're going to get Google that's going to offer you additional competitors. And we identified roughly about 20 organizations or 20 platforms that are out there. Some of these may look familiar to you. Some of these you may say, I'm not quite sure that's gamification. You can go ahead and move to the next one.
Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries. I see, keeping me on track. Okay. So some of the key competitors we already knew of. Of course, the premier players that are out there, M-Level, Axonify, Centrical, and Trivia, those are probably some of the biggest players that are out there. Then there were some others who we had not heard of or had gone through transitions and had become a new name. And so our team started with a qualified review of several of over 20 platforms, and we narrowed it down to a few that met those, I guess what we'll call the sniff test, right? They met key criteria in order to get us into a deep review. Because of course, as you can imagine, in a 2-week review period, we can only go through demos for a certain number. Next slide. And then we took our key criteria, we further defined, what it means for good learning style. So it needs to be mission-based, it needs to be chunked, it needs to support micro and nano content. There needs to be some kind of a reinforcement engine. We didn't declare that reinforcement engine had to be AI-based, but it sure was a benefit if it was. We took those 7 key criteria, and we turned that into a Likert scale for evaluation. But we also had some binary things in there, such as mobile first development. There needed to be, of course, that feedback mechanism that's going to, trigger back to the client's magic wand wish list. Content had to be searchable and searchable across a knowledge base. So really what that's saying to us is that there needs to be a clear and definable knowledge base that is separate, perhaps, from the learning base. AI and RPA functionalities, RPA meaning AI, artificial intelligence, RPA, robotic process engineering. So it needed to have some element of an intelligent way of getting content to the learner, of getting reinforcement to the learner. And then in addition to our Likert scale, our binary information, we also needed to provide a feedback mechanism for strengths and weaknesses for each platform. And when I say strengths or weaknesses, I want to be clear about something. We are not saying that the platform is strong or weak as compared to its competitors. What we were doing is we were evaluating strengths and weaknesses based off of the client's requirements, based off of the learner's needs, based off of the business needs. So these evaluation criteria will not necessarily be valid for just any client that's out there looking for gamification. It doesn't end up being a Yelp review. It doesn't end up being, well, this one's the best, because it's not necessarily the best if it doesn't meet the client criteria. Next slide. And then we needed to create a data collection model. So we had, like I had said, we had 5 reviewers who were going through these demos. We recorded all of these demos, and I will just say, if you go through a similar methodology, not only is it important to create a feedback mechanism such as this, but you also need to have those recorded demos, because things start going into noise. So one platform, has certain capabilities, you see another platform's capabilities, and now you've got to readjust your evaluation, because what you had once had as a 5 before may actually be a 4 viewed in the light of day. You also need the ability to go back and re-review and re-evaluate. But something else that as a organization that's making recommendations to a client, we had to make sure that we could go back and we could provide context to the reviews that we were providing. Next slide, Cara. So we ended up reviewing several platforms and providing output only for those platforms that we were going to be conducting the demos for. Next slide.
Yeah, and I think this slide's a repeat, right? I don't know what happened.
This slide is a repeat. Okay. So keeping things anonymized, because like I said, actually, could you go back to the previous one? Keeping things anonymized. We're just going to cover these as platforms 1 through 8. Because like I said, not every platform is created equal, and not every client's requirements are created equal. And so we ended up narrowing it down to 4 platforms, and we will show you the results, the result data, so that you understand why we narrowed it down to 4 platforms. But of the 4 platforms that we narrowed it down to, each of these platforms had solid gamification mechanics. 2 of the 4 had game-based learning. That is, they included games that were entertainment-based, not necessarily simulation-based. And I've been monitoring the comments, so I saw that to some of you, yeah, game-based, that's actually not what we're looking for. There's 2 areas of game-based. One is, in some game-based, it's games for entertainment, like a golf game or a bubble pop game. And, you know, if what you're looking for is engagement, that's one thing. But if the game is a simulation that simulates an activity, and that is a successful operation, that's where we find those games to perhaps be beneficial, because I can go through and I can create wildcards and I can generate unique circumstances for someone who is practicing a skill for the first time. That's where they become more beneficial. Vendor overviews. Let's go through some of these. And again, we're trying to anonymize these a bit. For platform 1, we found that this platform had a strong learning experience platform. That's what we mean by LXP. They had a number of user learner engagement templates. The platform looked and worked like a modern platform. And when I say modern platform, we're talking more about a mobile first platform. Some of the platforms, you know, they bit more on the web-based kind of side, a bit more web focused, and in some cases, maybe a little bit out of date. I guess that's what we'll call it. Platform had strong reinforcement-based engine, artificial intelligence-based engine, not only for learner reinforcement, but also for ingesting content. And that's one of the things that's often forgotten by these platforms. The platform may perform well, but it may take an enormous amount of work on the instructional design side of things. However, if there's an intelligence engine that can cull through your content and pull some of that content in, it becomes a much more attainable for success. And some of the areas of weakness, sorry, was there a question there?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So in some cases, you know, we're pointing out some weaknesses, but not a lot of weaknesses in this platform. But you know, perhaps maybe the UI was not as strong as some of the other more modern mobile platforms. Next platform.
Yeah, and I was just saying, in the interest of time, I'm going to click through these next few just to say, like, you know, this is sort of the approach we took, right? We identified strengths and weaknesses, you know, tried to sort of summarize what the outcome was for each of those 4 final platforms. And then, Tom, sorry, I'm going to jump you ahead to, you know, how we started to really summarize the data for them.
Keeping me on time, because ultimately this is the important point here, the important part here. So of the 4 platforms, we came about these 4 platforms because of the first binary information. All 4 of the key platforms either had those core functionalities or had mechanisms to support them. There was a seventh platform that the client wished to be evaluated because it had been employed in the organization before, but it didn't fit the key criteria. We included it in the review. If you go to the next slide. Here's where things really start to come together, and that is the Likert scale. So this may look complicated, but it actually is not very complicated to put together. We were using a Likert scale, and all we did is we took the swim lanes that you saw earlier, that is the learning styles, points management systems, built-in games, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we combined our data, normalized that data, and in the heat map that you're looking at here, you're seeing where blue is strong and red is weak or weaker. You begin to suss out the core differences between the platforms. And I wouldn't say that just because platforms 1 and 3 are more blue, that they are better platforms. They just happen to be strong in those areas of critical criteria. If you go to the next slide, Cara, we take a look at something like this radar chart, and this is where the differences between the platforms start to show through. And you can see that not all gamification platforms or game-based platforms are created equally. That is that they may all succeed in terms of the learning styles, the LXP, security and integration, customization, social, but it's on the right-hand side that we start seeing things break away, and it's at those points where the differences between the platforms become apparent. One platform is more heavily leaning in the direction of points and points management. That may be great for just a strong sales-based organization. We want to generate competition. We want to make sure that people are hitting their sales targets, their numbers, that their conversions of sales are happening. Okay, so that's more in a sales capacity. But in some cases, maybe it is engagement, and that engagement may be in the lines of social, manager, engagement with employees, peer-to-peer communication, or maybe it's just competition. So, that's where some of these platforms begin to suss out. But then we start to see, like in the example of platform 3, where it's just platform 4, where it's a good journeyman application, where it doesn't stand out among all of the others, but it does support all of those activities. And that's where things started to separate. And if you go to the next slide, something else that we found is that even though we were evaluating 4 platforms that had almost identical success criteria, we did note that 2 of the platforms really, what's the word I'm looking for, leaned in the direction of primary learning platform. That is, that this gamified platform could actually succeed as an LMS replacement. I wouldn't say that you should replace an LMS. All I'm saying is that they actually could be in an organization's primary platform, whereas 2 of the gamified platforms focus almost solely on interstitial learning. That is, sorry, I was looking at the chat that just came in. That is platform that supports programs almost in a marketing style, but is not necessarily a primary platform. And it is that separation between the 2 platforms where we were able to now move the client in the direction of, we're going to provide them with the evaluation criteria. We're going to set up an opportunity for the 2 platforms in question to demonstrate their product to the client group, and then that client to make a more meaningful selection. So as we look at it, as Cara and I look at it, we are partners for our client in helping them define what the evaluation criteria and what good looks like for them. Cara, I think that.
Yeah, and I think we did have
one last slide.
Quick hit there.
One last slide. This was something else that the client asked us to, after our final presentation, the client asked us to come up with an evaluation scale for pricing. And this is probably where you might run into some of your biggest challenges. Creating an apples to apples comparison between platforms, because they don't always measure up one-to-one. So what we were able to discern was that if we took 10,000 users as the baseline per annum, so per year, and then picked a number of campaigns, how would the costing per platform measure out? And then we assigned a value to each of the dollar symbols and then presented it that way. Maybe not necessarily a fair evaluation matrix, but as close as we could get. There we go.
Yeah, I think that does wrap us up. And I know we did run a couple minutes long, so I'm not so sure that we have time for much, if any, Q&A, but I'll hand it over back to you, Hope and Elizabeth, and you can take us to the finish line.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cara and Tom, for sharing these awesome insights with us today. We did run out of time for Q&A, but that is all. We're going to be passing along these questions that we have in the chat and Q&A panels, and be writing up a quick blog post to address those following the event today. So thank you so much again for sharing your insights with us.
Sure thing.
Awesome. And up next, Tom Branning is joining us from Biz Library for his session, Experience is Everything, Secrets that Drive Learner Success. Tom, are you with us?
I am, Hope. Sorry, I just
Wonderful.
had to find the right button there. I am.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks so much, Tom. Looking forward to your session today. And I hope all of you will stick around for Tom's session, which starts in about 10 minutes here, to grab a coffee, use the restroom, anything you need to do so you don't miss a moment of our next great session today.
Thanks, Hope. And I will, I'll answer a couple of the questions that did show up in the Q&A. I'll send some answers just via chat as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Before I hang up. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. See you in a bit.